Hello and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. The fall of Bashar Assad in Syria last month has left the geopolitical situation here very much in question. And the day-to-day running of the country, which has suffered under civil war for, 14 years, has left a lot of questions about the new governing authority under HTS, which is looking for the lifting of sanctions so we can start rebuilding that country or help rebuild that country after a decade of their civil war. There's questions remaining over whether the new governing authority will be tolerant of the minorities in Syria, which include the Allawites, the Christians, and the Druze. There are already reports of intermittent attacks on Allawites and revenge attacks on former police and military and operatives throughout the country in the northeastern section of the country. There are questions about the Turks and how much they are going to attempt to stifle, much less thwart the Kurdish independent territories there. Meanwhile, the United States has at least 2,000 U.S. soldiers stationed ostensibly to fight ISIS, but is also still looking out for its allies, the SDF, which are the Kurds that the Turks want to get rid of. I could go on forever. There's just a ton of things going on. We don't want to forget Israel, which has been encroaching into the buffer zone there. There had been a peace agreement with Syria, a buffer zone created. There have been UN peacekeeping there. Israel has moved military into that zone and says that it's not going to leave. It ostensibly says that it's there to fend off extremist militants, but we already have villagers in that part of the Golan Heights saying that the IDF has shot at protesters, has demolished homes, and is taking some of the territory forcibly. There's just so much to unpack here about what the future of Syria is at this point. And so I thought I'd bring on a couple of my friends, Matthew Petty, who is a journalist at Reason Magazine and has lived in the region, as well as Connor Eccles, who is, I believe, the managing editor at the Non-Zero newsletter with Robert Wright, who has also lived and studied in the region. They've been on the show before. Welcome back, guys.
Thanks for having us. I mean, yeah, just to clear up for the listeners, Connor and I were actually classmates in Jordan.
Yeah, we spent just about 4 hours a day together for quite a while there. So, yeah, we're well acquainted.
Yeah, no, he's ready to kill me by the end of it.
Well, listen, I really rely on your assessments, your perspectives as students and as journalists, and just as keen observers of the region and the politics in the region. And I know, Matthew, you've written very extensively before any of this happened about all of the militia groups and how the U.S. fit in and in terms of its funding and its management, whether it be in the southern part of the country or what was going on in northeastern Syria. Everybody is watching right now to see if Al-Jilani or Al-Shama will pursue this tolerant governing leadership in Damascus. Like I said in the opening, there's been some signs of retributive justice, but I can't get a sense just looking at Twitter whether there's some systemic issue here or what we're seeing is just sort of disparate events happening. Obviously, Jilani can't. He's not going to be able to control every militant and every faction in these sort of confusing post-Assad days. But can you talk a little bit about whether or not you believe or that you're seeing signs that he actually will pursue a more tolerant, centralized leadership, or do you think that there might be something else more nefarious going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is all in flux, and yes, it is very unclear from Twitter, but it's also just unclear for people outside the country in general. There is a little bit of a dearth of news. I think NPR and Washington Post has done to their credit some recent reporting, but even then you're only getting small windows, especially the situation on the coast. So I guess to make it clear to the listeners, when we talk about the diversity of Syria and also the division of Syria during the war, it's a lot of different moving parts. You have on the coast the Alawite community, which had kind of been the core, I guess, social constituency of the previous Syrian government, and they are, a minority within Syria. They're actually, even despite having disproportionately filled up the security services, they, for the most part, weren't that rich, and so right now they are kind of an exhausted, poor minority with, a lot of vengeance feelings towards them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the east of the country, you have Syrian Kurds. Although when people say that the SDF is a Kurdish independence movement, it's not really either of those things, because the core of the movement was Kurdish nationalists. But first of all, its demand within Syria is not independence, because there's just not a demographic and geographic base for an independent Kurdish state there. So what their demand has been throughout the war, and what I think they're going to try to negotiate with Jolani, assuming Turkey does not play spoiler, is some kind of autonomy for the entire Northeast, and including the sort of non-Kurdish communities that are now part of their project, like Arab and Syrian Christian communities. And then
for 1 second, just to clarify. So they don't have and I think maybe this gets a little muddied in the reportage. So there isn't a independent Kurdistan or a Kurdish territory within northeastern Syria that has been sort of maintained by the SDF with U.S. backing. Because
there is an independent territory, but they don't call it Kurdistan. They call it Northeast Syria, because it's encompasses a lot more than just the Kurdish community at this point. It's basically the entire east of the Euphrates is run independently from Damascus. But their demand has never been recognition as an independent state. I mean, I've heard some, U.S. officials float this idea but their demand has always been, to be autonomous within the Syrian state, but not to be ruled directly from Damascus. So in that way, it would be similar to Iraqi Kurdistan or something, but not as a Kurdish entity. And Iraqi Kurdistan also went further and tried to get independence. Right. I just think, geographically, Northeast Syria could not be a Kurdish entity, and it could not be completely independent from the rest of Syria. And then in the south of the country, you have the Druze community, which is another religious minority, which kind of was also loyal to the previous government, but kind of flipped in recent years and carved out its own autonomous space. And then down the backbone of the country, you kind of have the kind of Sunni Sunni Arabic-speaking majority. And then you have a Christian minority within Syrian cities. I think the situation for Christians may actually be better than Allawites, because Christians kind of don't pose a threat to the new Jolani regime. They're an urban minority, middle class. They're not going to take up arms and form a breakaway territory. I think the Druze and the Alawite and Kurdish situations are a lot more hot, if you will.
Yeah.
On the Alawite coast, you're right. There have been reports of reprisals and attacking people that were affiliated with the previous regime, but then also kind of just generalized violence against Alawites. And I think it is definitely an open question. You're right, whether Jolani will be able to kind of turn this into a targeted, specific and regularized kind of form of justice for wartime atrocities, or whether this is just going to become, beating down on a weak minority that was on top until about a month ago. And I think there's a lot to watch there. I've seen some pretty worrying things in recent days, and I think you're right to say that it's because Jolani doesn't control everything. I mean, on the flip side, the fact that Jolani doesn't control everything is a sort of silver lining in that it forces there to be more. It forces him to reckon with the diversity in Syria, right? He can't just rule with an iron fist and try to crush all the minorities himself, because his force is not that big, and he's taking over he took over Syria almost by consent, right? As soon as he pushed a little in Aleppo, and there was actual violent battles in Aleppo, and then when the Assad government failed there, the whole structure kind of collapsed, and then Jolani was kind of able to march, and there's pretty much acquiescence, and he was able to march into Damascus. And he also, so he is the kind of kingmaker, but or the king, I guess, but there's also other militias there, some in the north that are funded by Turkey, and just like really nasty people. And I think Jolani's strategy here is going to be kind of let these people burn themselves out fighting Kurds or fighting the SDF or fighting Allawites, and then deal with them later on. And then there's also forces in the south that are backed by Jordan that were sort of kept dormant through the war. Basically, after Russia and Assad had turned their attention to that area, they had, Russia and Jordan had brokered some deals, and these militias basically flipped and became pro-government militias. And as soon as the regime started to collapse, they rose up again, and they were actually the first ones to enter Damascus.
Wow.
Not Jolani's forces, but they're also, small and disparate, and they couldn't, Jolani kind of won by default because there was no way they were going to be able to govern the whole country by themselves. And I think both the southern and northern forces have a history of U.S. backing. The ones that are backed by Turkey, they're called the Syrian National Army. A lot of them received very extensive training and weapons from the CIA before the U.S. cut them loose. And then they found new patronage in Turkey and acquired a real reputation for just this nastiness and violence. And the U.S. ended up actually sanctioning some of them for looting and pillage and rape and such. The forces in the south, I think, are probably closer to the U.S., but Jordan is a sort of state actor managing that relationship.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Connor, Matt raised Turkey, and in the hours and days after Bashar Assad's demise, everybody was speculating, what did Turkey have to do with this? And then they'd speculate about what Turkey was going to do about the SDF and the Kurds, and what does Erdogan get out of this? And, how is the United States going to respond? I'm feeling that there has been less press attention on Turkey's strategy here and their approach. And that makes me a little nervous, because I feel like that they have been very aggressive over the last few years. There was an outright incursion, and I'm sorry, I don't have the year in front of me, but I've heard all sorts of reports of what they've been doing in villages and cities in northeastern Turkey now, and attacks, and I know that the U.S. is right in the thick of it, but I don't see a lot of clarity about what the heck is going on. And do you have any sense? And can you tell me about what worries you about this scenario?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the positive thing, and then I'll say what worries me. One positive thing that we've seen recently is the sort of remarkable fact that this very famous former PKK leader, the PKK being the Turkish group that Turkey considers, or the Kurdish group that Turkey considers to be a terrorist group within its borders, and they argue that the SDF essentially harbors them or works with them in northeast Syria, and that's kind of the center of a lot of this dispute. Kind of remarkably, representatives of the government in Turkey have been meeting recently with representatives of Öcalan inside of Turkey, who's currently in a Turkish prison, and starting to have some conversations about what it might look like to settle the conflict between the Turkish state and the PKK. Again, all this stuff is very complicated, but the long story short of that is, if they're able to, in tandem with everything that's happening, in Syria right now start to work out some kind of modus vivendi between the Turkish state and the PKK, then a lot of whatever I'll say next would not be a concern.
Right.
However, the problem is that hasn't happened yet. It seems very, reasonably unlikely to happen. There's been opportunities for some sort of kind of calm in the past that have not come to pass. And the concern is that Turkey does see the SDF as basically a terrorist group. Mm-hmm. And Turkey is now the #1 international player in Syria, bar none, right? So they are going to be putting pressure for the northeast region of Syria to be either demilitarized or disadvantaged in certain ways that are going to allow them to operate there more freely. They are going to potentially even attempt incursions into the country, like you said. If the situation starts to break down, I think that's plenty likely that we could see some sort of invasion. Not like a full scale invasion, but Yeah, well, go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, right now Turkey has just been unleashing the sort of Turkish-backed groups against the SDF, and there's been some clashes. And I think the U.S. came in and kind of said, "Boys, settle down," and brokered a ceasefire. But the kind of elephant in the room is that Turkey could, as it's done in 2018 and 2019, just directly invade with its own military. And I think the SDF would not be able to resist that, particularly because Turkey has air power and yeah.
And the SDF's air power is America.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Turkey and the U.S. can't be fighting. Obviously, we're allies. We're in NATO. So it highlights all these challenges that have been inherent to Syria for a long time, but that we got to ignore a little bit. And it gets at that problem of, like, on top of all this, we still have a couple thousand U.S. troops, more than we even thought, Kelly, like you mentioned at the start of this, which is absolutely, we, as I used to work for you as a reporter, and I spent a lot of my time bugging the Pentagon to tell me how many troops were in Syria. And for, however long, they said it was 900 troops, and it turned out to be 2,000, and it's been 2,000 for a while now. Yeah. And it's kind of, they say it's rotational, but it's a little alarming. It shows how, there's a bunch of U.S. soldiers that are in a situation that could go sideways at any point and could get us drawn in deeper. So that's another area of concern.
One of the questions that I've had from the very beginning, and it's because of some of the reporting that we've done, Connor, together, and what you've done too as well, Matthew, is the idea of or the reality of the oil fields there and how they've been under SDF control all this time, to the consternation of Bashar Assad, who said, basically that we were helping steal the oil for the Kurds. Well, their oil fields are still there. That's where most of them are in the country, from what I understand. At some point, Jelani is going to want his hands on that oil so he can bring some revenue into the country. Are we going to stay there and maintain some sort of protection or management on behalf of the SDF or the Kurds or whatever governing body is there? Or are we going, what are we going to do? This seems like a clash in the making. But I don't see a lot of press on this issue specifically. Have either of you seen any analysis on what might happen to the oil?
I think part of the problem is it's just so uncertain, because the oil really does become a secondary issue, or I would say a bargaining chip in the relationship between Damascus and the SDF. And ironically, I think this is one of those more say hello to the new boss, same as the old boss situations, where the situation between the new Jolani government and the SDF is going to be quite similar to the one between the old Assad government and the SDF, in the sense that, northeast Syria is not economically very developed and it's not very populous, but it does happen to sit on the food and energy resources for the rest of Syria, because that's the fertile Euphrates Valley and it's the oil fields. And I think, there was a little bit of a caricature. Some of the anti-war or anti-imperialist or whatever you want to call it crowd had a little bit of a caricatured idea that, like, the U.S. was going to suck up the oil, and put it in Americans' pockets. And there was a little bit of a harebrained scheme in 2020-ish to actually bring in an American contractor, and it was very strange. And I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions about what happened there and why the Biden administration.
What you're talking about.
Yeah. But in general, the consistent U.S. policy has basically been to allow the SDF to as part of the general backing for the SDF to help them control these areas. And it did become a weird way to sell that intervention to Trump too, because Trump was not interested in preventing Turkey from invading or preventing Assad from going in, but he was interested in this idea that the caricatured left-wing idea that America was going to steal the oil. And so it became this bizarre thing where they're basically trying to sell the SDF as like an oil field guard force. But I think, the piece of the puzzle where this fits into the broader puzzle is that oil is the SDF's bargaining chip. And this is not like extremely lucrative on the international market. They're not going to be exporting it at a huge profit. But because Syria is so energy poor right now, it just lost its supply of Iranian oil. So it's even worse off, and it's still under international sanctions, which is something we should talk about. Those oil fields actually could do could make a big difference domestically. And so I think, I think a lot is to be determined about how the SDF approaches Jolani, how Jolani approaches them, how the U.S. and Turkey work this out between each other. And I think that the oil fields are going to be a bargaining chip. Another thing is that part of northeast Syria has it's Deir ez-Zor province is where the oil is particularly restive. The SDF actually made some advances there after the old government fell, and then had to pull back because they just ran into so much local opposition. Not just because it's Arab, but also because it's rural, and they've got a sort of strong clan or tribal system there that's been hostile to the SDF. That's also going to be, I think, a sort of proxy war inside the proxy war, where if the Jolani government is smart, it's going to try to get the clans to make problems in the oil region for the SDF. And if the SDF is smart, it's going to be able to figure out how to manage the clan system to its own advantage. And it's a sort of wheels within wheels moving right now.
Connor, what about Israel? I mean, Israel basically has come in. They're sitting on the top of Mount Hermon. They say they're not going anywhere. They have disregarded any UN peacekeeping agreements, whether it be there or in Lebanon. So clearly, they don't care about the international goalposts or guideposts that were set up with Syria. They've been bombing Damascus. They say they're bombing old warehouses or ammunitions depots that had been set up and used by Bashar Assad. But it seems like they're doing whatever they want. Now, is there a concern that they will take more territory or just stay? They have the Golan Heights. What's the main concern about Israel and its wild card status in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's worth thinking about the geography of this area, because Israel kind of claims that this new thing that they're stepping into is a buffer zone in some ways between them and Syria. It's important to remember that the Golan Heights itself is supposed to be the buffer zone in theory between Israel and Syria. That's what it was from a previous conflict. Israel chose to occupy it in violation of international law, and the United States is the only other country that recognizes the annexation of that territory. But if you've ever been to the Golan Heights and you look over, I mean, it's just from the part that they were already occupying, you could see out everywhere. You could have all of your early air defense warning things that you need. You could have every single piece of military equipment necessary. I've talked to the UN peacekeepers on the border there before, and they're sitting there with binoculars looking out, and they seem very busy. But they'll chat with you, and they're there, and they're not going to put up a fight if you try to move past them. But the simple fact is, they already had as advantageous of a military position as you could possibly have. And the decision to advance forward onto Mount Hermon and to take more of that I really think should be seen as nothing but a land grab. I think it really doesn't make any good sense. And then the bombings across the country. I mean, the Israel and the U.S. to differing extents right now, I think are playing their hands poorly, right? So Israel, I think, is feeling very emboldened all around and sees an opportunity to destroy the capacities of an enemy or a potential enemy, with the fear that that could happen. The U.S. also sees a potential enemy in Jolani and is thus unwilling to completely lift sanctions and to completely do the things that are necessary for Syrian reconstruction. But my concern is that both Israel and the United States, by focusing so much on the possibility of a negative government in the future, are losing the opportunity to influence it now, right? Because there are a lot of people that are trying to influence Jolani and everything that he is trying to do in that country. There are people that are like international jihadists that have been working with him for years that want a certain vision for Syria. There are people who are more in the center who are going to work with him who want a secular vision for Syria. And then there are the Americans and there are the Israelis who might want a more like, it's not going to be westernized, but a more cosmopolitan vision for Syria. And if we
I don't know if that's necessary. I think that's probably true for the American public, and probably a lot of people in the American government would like to see that. But I don't think that the Israelis want. I think what they want is a Syria that's weak and can't oppose them, and they don't really care what it looks like.
That's probably true. Well, before we go into that tangent, I did want to ask you, Connor. It sounds like you think that the sanctions should be lifted. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, we should lift the sanctions, if only because the reason for their existence has gone. Bashar al-Assad fled the country. He is in Moscow. That is his regime. The reason for the sanctions is over. And if we want to add sanctions in the future as leverage or something like that, that's fine. But now we should get rid of them.
And Matthew, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think my position on this is the same position that it was before, in November 2023, which is the Syrian civil war is over. I didn't expect that Assad would fall so suddenly, but thank God that it happened without a major resumption. I mean, there were people died, but thank God it wasn't a drawn out struggle. And so it's the same thing. The Syrian civil war is over. The sanctions are preventing the country from rebuilding and moving on. Syrians need a breather. I think all the foreign powers, whether it be Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, the United States, should get their hands off and let Syrians figure this stuff out for themselves. That's not going to happen, sadly, because all of these powers, are not going to give up their assets. But I think at the very least, something that is both good politics and good policy is to just lift international sanctions. And when these sanctions were, so the U.S. imposed kind of two waves of sanctions. There was the early in the Civil War, kind of embargo on U.S. imports to Syria and embargo on Syrian oil, and among other things. And then in 2020, there was the Caesar Act. And this was sold as, a targeted sanctions package against the Assad regime, like, Assad's cousins can't go to Disneyland or something. And that was part of it. And that was how they sold it. But the fine print that nobody ever talked about was it also explicitly tried to deter reconstruction of Syria in order to sort of deny Assad the benefits of victory. Of course, that's also just denying Syrians the benefits of peace. And now we're seeing that, well, actually, it's not just against Assad, because the Caesar sanctions are still in place. And they apply to the government of Syria, not the Assad regime. So that's the Jolani government. Right. To their credit, the Biden administration has actually started issuing sanctions waivers. I didn't get a chance to read them, but I've seen others describe them as pretty sweeping, which is good. And I think, again, that's good policy and good politics to just let Syria. There's a lot of good things or good opportunities. There's a lot of factors pushing this in a bad direction. One of the easiest, simplest ways to take something out of the bad column and put it in the good column is just lift the damn sanctions, right?
Yeah.
Let Syria invest in oil. Let other countries invest in reconstruction.
Absolutely.
We're not even talking about aid, right? The Caesar Act was about reconstruction investment. I'm sure there's a lot of businessmen who see and women who see opportunities, and I think that money is probably very much welcome in Syria, and I think we should not get in the way of that.
Yeah, and I think that like part of the irony or kind of unfortunate situation here is that the Caesar renewal just ended up being in this year's like National Defense Policy, like National Defense Authorization Act, that was passed before the Assad regime fell. I think that if you put this question per se before Congress, that it might actually get significant support. Like I think there is significant political support for lifting the sanctions at this point. There are Republicans that are on board with this. There are Democrats that are on board with this. It's the right decision.
Yeah, Joe Wilson, who was one of the big Caesar Act guys, and really, and a few years ago when there was an earthquake in Syria, and the Biden administration, again, to its credit, issued some sanctions waivers to make it easier for reconstruction there. Because I guess war reconstruction is bad, but natural disaster reconstruction is good. Right? Joe Wilson was like, you can't give an inch, this is just benefiting the regime, et cetera, et cetera. And then now, because Jolani's in power, he's suddenly like, well, lift the sanctions. But it's so, on one hand, that is kind of a gotcha. Like, these people are finally admitting the sanctions are bad for Syrians.
Right,
but
right.
Also, I think it does show that like there is a constituency. I think Connor's 100% right that a lot of these, even though the letter of the law and the effect of the law is not against Assad, a lot of the people voting for these and sponsoring these bills actually did think of it as an anti-Assad thing. So, and I think it's imperative that this gets done quickly so that they don't just drum up, an excuse to keep the sanctions for a different reason.
Yeah. Which could happen if all of a sudden ISIS has the resurgence that everybody is predicting, and we're dragged into more conflict there. I think you're absolutely right.
Or if Jolani acts more authoritarian than people want.
Right.
Which,
yeah.
Again, I think if that happens, that would be bad, but I don't think it would be a good reason to prevent reconstruction, but it might become an excuse to prevent reconstruction.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you coming. And this is just, I have tons more questions, but we don't have all the time in the world. But will you come back on and talk to me if and when? And I'm sure there are developments on the realm of sanctions and also U.S. troops. I want to talk more about that at some point too. Like, are we going to get out of there? Or will there be, like ISIS, a justification for keeping our troops mirrored in Syria? So I hope you will come back.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for having me on. I hope to come back again too.
Thanks, guys.